Okay, you are live.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. We have quorum. Item 2, approval of minutes. I'm going to defer that. I've asked for a little more detail in the minutes. It was pretty bare bones this time, so we're just going to move that to the next one. Approval of the order of business. Any deletions or additions? What we're doing today is kind of business arising, but we'll continue on to 9.1. Any conflicts to declare at this time? Hearing none. There's some correspondence that has come in that was shared with the committee. So we're going to have a presentation from Ben and perhaps members of the team, the center plan team. We're going to focus today on established residential in the downtown. And the way we're going to approach it is we're going to hear about established residential from Ben in a few slides, and then we'll have opportunity to discuss that. And when we wrap that up, we'll move on to the downtown discussion. So if that's okay, we'll move to you, Ben, and start off with established residential.
Okay, thank you, Fred, and through the chair, I'm going to switch to sharing my screen. And as you just mentioned, I have a few slides on the established residential to dive into that designation of the zones in a bit more detail, hopefully covering some of the questions that were raised last time. And then I think that will hopefully lead in well to questions and discussion of a committee on that topic. So, okay, here we go. Okay, and can everyone see the screen of my PowerPoint? Okay, yep. See some heads nodding. Okay, so just as a brief reminder, I'll hit the high level overview and then get into a bit more details. The established residential designation, as committee members know, is applied to the predominantly low density, low rise residential areas of the regional center. So pretty large areas of Halifax and Dartmouth. And the overall purpose is to retain the scale of the existing low density neighborhoods, similar height, similar built form, but while also providing more housing options. So some of the highlights are the permitting secondary suites and backyard suites, shared housing, home occupation, and daycare uses. Fairly consistent with some of the existing permissions out there. Consolidating the differences between Dartmouth and Halifax and providing a bit more flexibility where it makes sense. We talked about last time about allowing for local commercial and institutional uses to be considered by development agreement. So instead of an as-of-right zoning approach, enabling this to be kind of considered on a site-by-site basis with some site-specific controls, particularly around hours of operation. The main meat of the designation is to establish 4 different zones: the established residential 1, which is a 1-unit zone plus accessory suites; established residential 2, which is more of a 2-unit zone plus accessory suites; the established residential 3, which allows for townhouses and also 3-unit buildings plus accessory suites; and a cluster housing zone, which is proposed to replace the previous land lease community zone. And they, to fine-tune some of the controls for the different subdivisions and neighborhoods and to reflect their character. The designation also establishes 5 precincts and 10 special areas to fine-tune things like lot coverage and setbacks in different neighborhoods. So going into a bit more detail than I did last time around, I included an excerpt of our kind of online map to kind of further explain the zone placements. And I think that's probably one of the most significant changes, is kind of the nature of the ER1 and the ER2 zones in particular, and how they're placed I think responds to some of the committee members' comments and also a lot of the public feedback we got. So in general, the existing R1 areas, the areas that are characterized by single unit dwellings are proposed to be zone ER1. So that kind of continues with that kind of single unit dwelling form. And of course, council has already approved the allowing for secondary backyard suites. Similarly, for the R2 areas in both Halifax and Dartmouth, places that already allowed for semi-detached built-into duplexes or contain a mix of those types of buildings are proposed to be zoned ER2. And I think the area that is a bit of a change from the existing planning documents. The areas, I guess, that probably characterized as being up zones is there's a placement of the ER zoning along existing and planned transit corridors. So this just pointing at this map. Can people see my cursor? Does that work? Yep, I think I see a head on. So here's the ER3. This is a kind of this is Chibukta Road. It's not labeled here, but Chibukta Road, which is a proposed BRT route, is Connaught Avenue. Sorry, proposed BRT route, and it's that's why it is ER3 zoning along it. The intention isn't to encourage a major change, but a gradual evolution of these corridors. Given that it's well served by transit. Here we have some ER1 neighborhoods that are carried forward from the single unit dwellings, and then ER2 areas. And I'll also just point out this little ER3 zone patch here, and this is part of the policy to apply that zone to existing zones that are already zoned for townhouses, to kind of not take away those options. So that's why when looking at the zoning maps, you might see ER3 zones placed in, might seem like odd locations. It's just to carry forward the existing permissions under the existing zoning. In terms of downzone areas, it's generally pretty limited, but it is intentionally proposed for proposed HCDs, so places like the Hydra Stone and other low density HCDs, and that's intended to protect, I guess, to discourage redevelopment before those HCD processes can go forward. Other places that there might be a little bit of down zoning is existing multi-unit buildings within established residential blocks. So if there's a one-off apartment building, these aren't always applied an HR1 zoning to recognize that they don't necessarily set a precedence and they're fine to exist, but not necessarily appropriate to expand. And also some larger R2 zone parcels were under existing zones. If you had large parcel, you might be able to do more than 2 units or up to 4 units. That if you have a large lot in those cases, that wouldn't be the case anymore. And a way of kind of mitigating impacts between the change of zoning is quite a bit of, not quite a bit, some more flexibility provided for existing non-conforming uses, residential uses in particular. So especially in the proposed HCDs area, which are intentionally downzoned to ER1, the intent is that if you have an existing duplex or a townhouse, that it would be grandfathered in. You can rebuild if there's a, heaven forbid, a fire or something like that, and can even expand that structure, provided you still meet zone requirement. And in existing multis as well, are more limited in terms of expansion if they're non-conforming, but also could rebuild if there is ever to be destroyed for some reason. There are some discussions and questions about the cluster housing zone, so I thought it would be important to go into this one in a bit more detail. This zone is applied to existing mobile home parks and large or regular shaped flag lots. Aren't too many of them, but there are a few scattered in the regional center. For mobile home parks, they'd still be subject to the mobile home park bylaw and wouldn't be subject to some of the limits on dwelling units on the same lot. And otherwise, other than mobile home parks, the zone limits it to up to 24 low density units on the same lot. And this is to kind of prevent kind of a more of a gated community approach. Right? Once you get above a certain number, you start to get into, well, maybe it should be a public road, for connectivity reasons and so on. And within each kind of within the cluster dwellings, the zone allows for up to 4 cluster housing dwelling units per block or per building. So like a 4-unit townhouse, for example, and in the same building, but clustered on the same lot. And some controls on density similar to other low density zones as a maximum of 4 bedrooms per cluster housing dwelling unit. There's also amenity space and pathway requirements and controls about front yard siding requirements, so that if the zone does have a lot of frontage on the road, the building must be located up by the road. And in terms of things like maximum building height and lot coverage and side to rear setbacks are all fairly similar to the established residential zones, so a maximum building height of 11 meters and so on. So it really is attempting to allow for that low density form, just clustered on the same lot, accessed by a shared driveway, instead of in places where the development of a public road isn't desirable, doesn't make sense because of the lot configuration. So in the next slide, I'll just show a couple of examples from Dartmouth, just off of Windmill Road. So here we have a cluster housing zone applied to existing mobile home park. So that's a way of continuing to permit that use in this location here. And just up the road, there's another proposed cluster housing zone in response to some correspondence we have. Again, it's kind of a flag shape, is a narrow frontage that it's just really for a driveway, and it's an odd configuration of lot where, you know, putting in a public road may not be feasible, but clustering a number of low density dwellings would be in staff's view would be compatible with the surrounding low density context and could make efficient use of that land. Townhouses is another topic, you know, we talked about in the past, and I think talked about at last meeting. Under the proposed documents, it's proposed to be only permitted in the ER3 zone. The last version proposed it in the ER2 zone as well, but in this case, we're just talking about ER3 zone. Like the previous draft, it's would allow up to 8 units per townhouse block, so that the blocks could only be so big. There are some new facade articulation requirements proposed, intended to make sure that each townhouse unit is distinguished from another through changes in projections or color. And it also proposes a slightly reduced minimum lot area, especially for interior lots, just to more closely match some of the existing zoning and developments that we're seeing. Some typical built form controls, and of course this varies depending on the area through the mapping and the special areas. But in general, the minimum front or flanked yard is between 0.5 and 4 meters, and some areas have seen a slight increase just to match the existing setbacks on the streets. The minimum side yard is 1.25 meters, and the minimum rear yard of 6 meters. The maximum lot coverage is generally between 35 and 50%, varied through the special areas. Generally, it's around 40%. And one that I highlight here is in response to some feedback, we are proposing to exclude one accessory structure no greater than 20 square meters from this lot coverage. And this is because under that size, permits aren't required. And I thought it was reasonable that for lots that are over the coverage, that could still put a small shed on their property. The maximum height is generally consistent at 11 meters, which is just a little over 35 feet, actually 36 feet, just in the conversion from the feet to metric, with the exception of 9.2 meters in the historic Dartmouth neighborhood and a special area in the Harbor View proposed Heritage Conservation District. And that 9.2 meters is intended to carry forward the existing height limits in those areas, and also the 8 meters on registered heritage buildings. And also note that the attached garages are the regulations don't allow them to be built any closer than the street line than their front wall of the main building, so that the garages don't dominate the streetscape. As noted, there's some established residential special areas through 5 precincts and 10 special areas that customize the built controls. Things like lot size, frontage, and side yards, and lot coverage to reflect the kind of unique characteristics of different neighborhoods, recognizing they were developed during different phases and ages. These controls do not impact materials, colors, and details. Those types of items are really left for the proposed HCDs to consider, and they might be some areas might have to see different additional controls through that proposed HCD process. And overall, it's intended to maintain the character without impacting permitted uses. I'll quickly touch on secondary and backyard suite as well. Now, this is the approach in the central plan documents. It's consistent with the region-wide amendments that allow it accessory to 1 and 2 unit dwellings. This means 1 secondary or backyard suite permitted in a lot containing a single unit, 2 unit, and semi-attached. And I highlighted 3 unit dwelling, especially in regards to the ER3 zone. The new structures containing backyard suite must meet the accessory structure requirements. So, 1.25 meters from the side and rear lot lines, a maximum height of 5.5 meters, and some maximum size of the footprint of the building and the floor area. So the backyard suites can only be so big, essentially the same size as any other accessory building. And a new proposed for flexibility in this last draft is propose some existing flexibility for existing accessory structures. So imagine an existing garage on our property to enable those to be to develop into a backyard suite, regardless of its height or footprint or setbacks, provided all other applicable requirements are met. And this is a response to the experience in administering the region-wide amendments, where we've had a lot of applicants and inquiries, people looking to convert existing accessory structures to a backyard suite, kind of raising concerns that if they couldn't meet the requirements in the proposed package B, that they wouldn't be able to be converted into a backyard suite. And we are proposing this because we think this is a fair way to enable some of these existing structures to be converted. Given that a lot of them would have been built at times when perhaps there are no requirements for side yard setbacks, for example. Briefly touch on shared housing. This was, I don't think there's any changes from the previous draft, or no significant changes. These are shared housing is a type of use that's supposed to be permitted in all residential zones at a compatible scale. Shared housing, it kind of refers to, housing essentially doesn't meet the definition of a typical dwelling unit that has its own independent kitchen and bathroom, where for facilities are shared for economic or for reasons of care. In the ER zones, it's limited. This means housing that contains 4 but no more than 10 bedrooms, depending on the zone. There's different controls in place, and it kind of meets the following conditions: that they're rented separately, or need some sort of medical assistance, it's licensed, or it's operated by a nonprofit organization. So the approach here is intended to reduce barriers to the kind of different forms of housing in low density areas, with controls intended to ensure that it maintains the same form and scale as all other residential uses. I think coming to the end of my slides here, we'll touch on the bedroom counts. Again, no significant changes from the previous draft. This is another way of controlling density, in addition to kind of lot coverage and building heights. It's an approach that's currently used in portions of the Halifax Peninsula, and it's supposed to be extended throughout the regional center. And the maximum bedroom counts range from between 6 bedrooms for a single unit dwellings and up to 10 bedrooms for a 3-unit dwelling. And I'll just kind of end this a bit of a more detailed overview on the established residential designation zone by highlighting that we have updated the ER zone comparisons that were published, I believe, last fall. So here's an example from the Dartmouth land use bylaw and center plan, comparing some of the existing zones, what's permitted under the existing zones that were proposed under the package B, and some of the key differences between them. So these are posted on the center plan website, and would encourage, if there's interest, I'd encourage members to take a look at that if you're kind of curious about what is changing between some of the existing zoning and the proposed zoning, and hopefully this is helpful to residents as well. Okay, and I think that with that, I will stop sharing, and I have slides for downtown, the downtown Halifax. So once the committee members want to move on to that topic, but I think it's a good time to pass it back to Fred as the chair, and happy to take some questions, and just note they have a number of members of the team here that may be called upon to help with any details.
You're muted, Mr. Chair.
I guess we all should be used to unmuting ourselves. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Great presentation. Let's move to a discussion of and some questions on the established residential side of things. Please indicate by clicking the raise hand button, and I'll call on you, and you can put your question or comment to Ben or in the team. Any questions, any issues with the established residential side? Who do I see here? Dale.
You can see me, can you? I couldn't
Yeah.
figure out whether I turned it on or off. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. I'm unmuted. Thank you, Ben, for that. It must be my head, but there's so much detail there. By the time I wrap it around ER1 and we're at ER3, I've totally lost the gist of what it is. Could we go back to the beginning a bit and think about what we are doing with ER1, ER2, 3, the corridors and cluster housing, et cetera? How much additional housing is in those areas in Halifax and Dartmouth? New housing.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And through the chair, just to clarify, are you asking what kind of, how much potential new housing could be accommodated under the proposed zone, or?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna ask like Ross Grant or Kasha to help me out with some of these numbers. I think they've been looking at it, but before we kind of get in there, kind of remind community members that the intent of the ER designation isn't necessarily about accommodating a lot of growth. That is intended for the centers and future growth nodes and corridors, but it is intended to support different housing options, different types of households that we see, single parent and the smaller household size that we have, and that the zoning potential is intentionally a lot more than what you expect to happen if to provide that flexibility. Having said that, Rosh or Kasha, if you wanted to jump in, because I believe this is something that you'd be revisiting to get a sense of the changes.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And through the chair to the committee. So we did run some analysis of how the different zoning would add additional units to the established residential designation. So the way that we did that was basically looking at the previously permitted zones through the existing, previously permitted units to the existing zones, and then comparing that to the capacity that the center plan zones would bring. Again, it's not a prediction of how many units, just a potential difference if every lot had the maximum number of units. But it's about, in rough terms, about 20,000 units that would be brought in with the zoning. But again, that's sort of an all things considered equal situation where you wouldn't consider lot coverage and that kind of stuff, just what the zone would permit.
So a bit of a follow-up. When I was on the HRM by design, it was frequently said that stable conditions would persist in the residential and what we think of now as ER zones. It was not intended at that point that these units should be taken out of that area but found elsewhere. And it was not that they didn't think they could carry it or not, but it tried to respond to what people wanted, the character of their neighborhood, which for many of these places has been for a very long time. And so you have added in, and I'm not against this at all, some different options. And it's not just numbers, it's options, different types of residential or even commercial. But I don't think that was the original plan. What rationale moved you to that from the original plan, which was most of the housing would be outside of the stable residential areas? Because that was said again and again to those people.
Okay, thanks for the comment and question, and through the chair. I suppose first I think I need to prospectively disagree with, I guess, with the premise. I think we are following direction from the purple document. Most importantly, it does talk about yes, maintaining the character and the nature of a low density area, but at the same time accommodating different housing options. So the challenge has always been the balance, and what is maintaining character to one person is different to another. So is allowing for a secondary or backer street changing the character of the area, or is that allowing for gentle density in a way that's more hidden and maintaining the character. So we're taking, in this draft, we're taking the view that allowing for secondary suites and for maintaining some of the permissions for semi-detached in some neighborhoods is maintaining that character and putting a focus on the built form. So having a little bit less concern about how a building is broken up inside, whether or not it's a big home that has 2 units in it, or it's one big home with a large family in it, is less concerning how many units are in that building than what it looks like, the size and shape of it from the outside. So that's why we focus on things like setbacks and building heights and things like that, while providing some flexibility for how the number of units on a lot, which isn't directly is related but isn't a direct link to density. With things like bedroom counts and other controls in place to try to maintain the overall scale of the built form. I think the notable exception to that, and I know there's been some comments from committee members, and one that I think we were trying to balance competing objectives is proposal for the ER3 zone along the transit corridors. And this is trying to balance the direction from the integrated mobility plan and just the overall strategic growth framework about enabling more density or more housing in areas that are well served by transit, with also the desire to allow for to maintain the character of low density areas. And the thinking there is that townhouses are a housing option that do provide that are suitable to some families, and rather than trying to find a way to permit it in the regional center without requiring a rezoning process or some sort of more complex conflict process, and those major transit corridors and staff seem to make the most sense, and that's why it's in the proposed draft.
So the traffic corridors frequently circle large numbers of what we call residential blocks, etc. So what is the separation between those and the regular residential blocks, between the corridors and the residential blocks?
Thanks for the question. And through the chair, I think you're asking how were the ER3 zones applied, or how? Yeah. So the ER3 zone is two main criteria from a policy perspective. Is one is applying the zone to existing areas that already have some sort of townhouse type zone on it. So that's why you might see the odd ER3 zone looks like to be on a low density street. It's usually because it's carrying forward an existing permissions. You didn't want to take away the option to develop townhouses that were already in place. And otherwise, this last draft I think does pull back the ER3 zone from in comparison to the last draft to really focus on major transit routes that happen to go through some low density areas, especially like the proposed BRT route, which would be quite frequent transit service. So the experience from other cities, we feel like that type of change in zoning doesn't spur fast change in the neighborhood. It's but a kind of more of a gradual increase in housing option along those important transit corridors.
So it's as of right, isn't it? You just DAs to do these. So
yeah, no, it'd be as a right. It'd be as a right, and there are our controls about setbacks and landscaping and some design controls around townhouses as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I've found, and I've been a bit negligent myself because of health reasons, that we've had very scattered meetings. It's very hard to get the theme of what we're trying to do, and I feel I can't get a connection between what we're now doing and what we were thinking we were doing as we move through the other areas. The corridors are smack dab against some of them, against the R3. We're looking for a fair amount of population growth in there. Is it necessary? Where does it put us in the overall? But where does it bump up against the overall numbers? So I'm not asking necessarily to have answers to all these, but I feel that as we've walked through this, it's been very, very complex. It's been very, very intermittent. And as a community members, and I think you know this already, very hard to stay in touch with the rationale and whether it's the right rationale and whether it fits into the vision of Halifax and Dartmouth. I don't know. I mean, the character neighborhoods in Dartmouth are very beautiful, but they have been gradually pushed, I find, as I drive through there by corridors that don't reflect the character of that particular area, both residential and the corridors. Anyway, for all that's worth, I think you've done a good job, but I'm disappointed in the lack of understanding of why we're doing all of this.
Thank you, Dale. Lindell, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Really quickly, and Ben, you mentioned it. I might have some other stuff later on, but I wonder if you can go back a little bit and talk about the first draft and then our current draft when it comes to ER3 and maybe even ER2, because there were some changes that you mentioned, and I just wonder if you can expand a little bit about that, because I know that was some concern earlier on with the committee of the ER3 and how that integrated, and there were changes made because of feedback from many different folks. So I just wonder if you could take a little bit more time to talk about some of those changes.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Councillor Smith, and through the chair. Thanks for the opportunity, I guess, to further clarify the changes. So I think overall, the previous draft was proposing to allow townhouses, for example, in the ER2 zone, and along these transit corridors applied ER3 right along the transit route, but an ER3 right behind it, and it would often result in neighborhoods being kind of split zone between ER1 and ER2 and ER3, and kind of heard concerns from this committee and also residents that it was potentially a lot of change, especially the ER2 zone allowing townhouses in areas, with it being kind of unclear why a certain side of the street was zoned one way and then the next block over was zoned differently. So I think taking the cue from this committee and also all the public feedback we received, we adjusted the zones and the zones placement, especially to try to carry forward to reflect the existing zones now in Dartmouth and Halifax, recognizing that there are neighborhoods that have been zoned R1 or single unit dwelling for a long time. And similar, there are neighborhoods that have been zoned that allow for 2 units for a long time that have a mix and wanting to maintain that without supporting a lot of change. So overall effort to I guess, limit the amount of change between the current zoning and the proposed zoning, and that's where we have the kind of pulled back on the number of different housing forms were permitted in the ER2 zone, and then the placements of the ER1 to ER2 zones really applied to whole neighborhoods instead of using transit corridors to do that. The ER3 zone, as I mentioned, was a bit more of a challenge where we have reduced instead of a 4 units, are proposing to be a 3 unit zone, but still allowing for accessory suites, and it would be the zone that would allow for townhouses, because we feel that townhouses is a desirable and appropriate housing for low density housing form, and should be permitted in strategic locations in a regional center, with the transit routes being the most logical request to kind of thinking for if we ever were to get an application or request to put townhouses somewhere, where would be the most appropriate location? Well, would be along those transit routes. So overall, I think we're trying to reduce the amount of change between the current zoning and the proposed zoning, and just highlighting that ER3 zoning is probably the exception to that, where try to mitigate the amount of change, but I do have to acknowledge that it is a change along some routes.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben and Lindell. Now I have Sean Clary. Sean, you're a guest. I'm not sure what the protocol is for guest commentary, but I guess councillors can kind of chime in when they like. So go ahead with your comment or question.
Thanks, Fred. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So just, I'm going through this because there's been a few changes, but to Dale's point earlier, I remember when we started this actually before I even became a counselor. I went to the sessions at Citadel High School. And I remember seeing the early boards, and I remember, there's a lot of things that have changed since those early iterations compared to the first draft of package A and now the last draft of package B. But those early center plan presentations indicated that about 16, I might be off on the number by a little bit, 16, 17% of the new population growth in the urban core could be accommodated in the established residential zones, either through backyard suites, secondary suites, some increased density allowances. And so whatever growth happens, it would have been very minimal. So staff can correct me on that number if they recall it from those early sessions. The map that Ben showed earlier is actually the neighborhood Fred and I live in. And the section that ER2 was shown on is currently R2. And if your lot's big enough, you can actually get up to 4 units in that neighborhood. And so in some ways, going to ER2 is actually a down zone in that residential neighborhood. If people want to buy up lots and consolidate lots and that sort of thing to have a fourplex. So that wouldn't be allowed now, and that you'd be able to have 2 units, maybe a secondary suite. To Dale's point about why are we doing this? So I was just looking at the census data from 2011 and 2016, and I'm really very excited. I hope you guys all filled out your census forms that came in the mail in the last little while. But if you look at that neighborhood that Ben showed, so just north and just south of Quinpool Road between Roby and Connaught, those neighborhoods lost 500 people in 5 years between 2011 and 2016. So because there was no change in the built form, so that is the houses didn't change, the lower number of people per household caused a loss of population. And that's the challenge we're looking at. So if you look at the 2011 and 2016 census, and I would imagine this trend will continue this year when we have the 2021 census data, the only household sizes that were growing were 1-person and 2-person households. If you look at 3, 4, 5+ person households, those all stayed the same or shrank. And so the demographics in our community is changing dramatically. And to Ben's point, we need to accommodate the different types of family size that we have now. And singles are becoming a much larger proportion of the overall household type. And the reality is a huge number of homes, especially I'm most familiar with the West End, especially the old part of the West End, couldn't actually accommodate much of this growth. My old house that I lived in just before here on Klein Street was 1,089 square feet and had a 5.5-foot high basement. And so you just physically could not get any more units on that. And it was only a 35 by 100-foot lot. So, there's no way you could accommodate more people on a lot that size. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, I'm going through this, looking at things like the setbacks, looking at the heights, those remain relatively the same as they are now. And so in terms of the protections and of the character of our neighborhoods, it's really those design guidelines around how tall you can make a building, how close it can be to a property line in your neighbor's building, that make them look more like houses than it would be apartment buildings and that kind of thing. Now, having said that, my neighborhood is a fantastic, diverse, mixed neighborhood. I've got duplexes all the way up the road here. We've got 4-unit apartment buildings on the corner of Oak and Poplar and throughout the neighborhood. So over the years, the decades, my neighborhood is quite a mixed neighborhood in terms of the built form, that the type of people who live here, the ages of those people and so on. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're promoting. So can you just confirm for me that the heights and the setbacks are still there in terms of like 35 feet, and also those population growth absorptions of 16, 17%, those are roughly still the same now as they were back in 2015, 2016, that you're projecting how much can be accommodated in those established residential areas of the new growth that's happening? It's like a pretty small amount of the overall population growth that we're expecting. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the comments and questions. If I can respond to the chair through Fred. First, in terms of the overall kind of growth targets, I think those were outlined in what we call the purple document, or the guidance and plan document. And yes, that continues to guide our work today. The one thing I will note is that 16 or 17% and those documents are grouped together, both established residential and higher order residential together. So that was intended to group both those together. So it didn't really distinguish between the two in those documents, but we kind of consider the higher order residential is probably at least 10% or more of that. With the established residential, I think, as you point out, really about not going backwards. Because if you do nothing, if you don't allow secondary suites, you don't allow more flexibility, actually the existing housing stocks are going to accommodate less residents just because of the general trend of decreasing household size. So, you know, I think we're talking about a modest increase in housing and housing options to, you know, at least not go backwards, and a modest increase in density in these low density areas. The second question, though, in terms of the setbacks in the built form, yes, you're absolutely right. We're trying to maintain the existing built form controls, and that's one of the reasons why we're proposing these different established residential precincts and special areas. I mean, there are a few minor changes, and you know, in some cases it's about harmonizing things between Dartmouth and Halifax, or just because there weren't the controls. It might be surprising for people to learn that there were actually no height limits in the established residential areas in Dartmouth, and so we're proposing one. Or in Halifax, there is no setbacks for accessory structures. You could go right up to the property line, and so for consistency, we're proposing a similar setbacks are already can change in Dartmouth. So I won't say there's no changes, but we're trying to be very limited to it. And that, again, that's one of the main reasons why to have these established residential special areas. And we'll point to those side by side fact sheets that are now posted on the central planning website. If anybody wants to really go dive in detail what's the change between, you know, R1 in Halifax with the proposed ER1, you can. We did our best to try to make that side comparison quite easy.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you both. Just it might be worth clarifying the growth targets for the you know, set in the previous documents and so on for the regional center are they set for the regional center as a whole, or are they set area by area? So in other words, you don't probably need growth in every single area to achieve the growth targets for the regional center. So are the growth targets area by area, or are they for the regional center as a whole?
It's if I may, it's a bit of both. So the purple document outlines it kind of has a target of, oh gee, I forget the total number of residents by the year 2030, and it aligns with the regional plan about accommodating at least 25%, and the IMP actually about 40% of the growth. And I'll describe them a little bit more projections or estimates than concrete targets. And then the guiding documents break down, okay, if we're going to accommodate the X number of thousand more residents in the regional center, where in different designations, where are we expecting to or targeting to accommodate them? And the majority is the centers, the corridors, and your future growth nodes. Those are the area that are targeted for probably the most significant amount of change, and they could accommodate a lot of the growth with limited change in the established residential area. So no growth in established residential areas, but certainly some and direction to accommodate different housing options.
Okay, so what proportion of the, sorry to chime in, but what proportion of the needed growth is in the established residential areas?
Thanks for the question.
16%. I have it open in front of me and I'm dropping it in the chat. There it is, okay. 16% of growth.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Who else do we have here? Wei, you're next.
So I apologize for interrupting there, Mr. Chair, but I am frankly giddy because I just finished 4 solid days of review of the center plan and writing up my notes and amendments I will bring to Halifax and West after a staff review. And so to the questions from you, Fred, and from Dale, this committee in early July or early 2017, before it came to council in June, endorsed the purple document, which calls for a 16% increase in residential areas, established residential areas and higher order residential areas, and included secondary suites. Now, council, because of our housing crisis and a bunch of other things, has already added secondary suites in every zone. There is no pure R1 anywhere anymore. But this document, the purple document, and I put the link in there for the new members of the committee who weren't around at that time, also endorsed the idea of corridor development and stuff like that. But I think what's interesting is this committee at the time didn't see a lot of difference between the proposed corridors at that time, corridor zone, and the higher order residential zone. And that's something you can see in the minutes in the staff report, because the building format was pretty much the same, almost identical, some slight differences. But the main difference was the residential wouldn't be allowed to have commercial on the ground floor, or required to have commercial on the ground floor, the ability to have commercial on the ground floor. And so one of the big dynamic discussions we've had at this committee and at the standing committee and at the community and regional council through this whole process was being a little bit worried about the corridor and higher order residential being too aggressive when you started to get down Roby and Oxford and whatnot. And there were early drafts where you saw significantly more HR and corridor than you see in the draft that, well, package B that we passed, package A that we passed, and package B now. So I actually had a moment while I was going through this, wishing that the idea of ER3 had existed 2 years ago, because I would have put that on Roby at Camp Hill instead of the corridor that's there now, but it didn't. So here we are, and that's fine. But after reviewing this, you know, in my area, in the District 7, I'm just going to bring up my notes and very concisely, I can share it all. I will be putting this up in my newsletter shortly, but the you know, right now there's these things called detail areas in the MPS right now that in the current land use bylaw allow for significant development, but it's largely in the R2 zone and the R1 zone. So, you know, a lot of folks call me when they move to the neighborhood and they buy a house down there on Bellevue or whatever, and then they're horrified to find out that their neighbor just sold their house and it's being turned into 3 units. That's allowed right now. If the house hasn't changed since the 1950s or 1982 in some zones, or in other zones, if the lot is 6,000 square feet and the frontage is 60 feet, you're allowed to do 3 or 4 units. And you know, I think there were really good reasons why that committee in 1982 tried to do what they thought was a very sensitive approach. But what that practically means is most of these houses, if you cram 4 units into them, it doesn't matter how big the lot is, it doesn't really work that well. And so the proposal we have in front of us now, you know, I've coined the phrase side zoning. It's not up zoning or down zoning. All these areas are already allowed to have now secondary suites and backyard suites. What we're proposing is standardizing that ER2 will allow 2 units and ER1 will allow 1 unit, but they're allowed to do their backyard suites or secondary suites as well. The other thing about the current zoning, which is problematic and makes it really hard to get good results, is that in 1982, they focused on a minimum size for apartments. The apartments had to be 1,000 square feet or 800 square feet. We have the exact opposite approach with backyard suites. Can't be bigger than 80 square meters. And what that means is you're more likely to end up with a 1 bedroom in a basement than you are a house being divided up into bits and losing its kind of primary function as a home upstairs and having a little bit of income coming in. And it also means that it's really problematic because some of the houses are very small when you go down into the older neighborhoods of Marlborough and all that. And they're never going to be able to fit in a 1,000 square foot apartment, but they can do a backyard suite. So, you know, what I'm saying to residents when I send this newsletter out that I have to, you know, spell check and the added complication of having to convert every measurement from metric to imperial so that you can actually compare them. And I haven't had a chance to finish that yet. But my recommendation to residents is it's actually quite good. This reduces and eliminates most of the most problematic conversions that we see. It creates clarity around where things are allowed in the ER1 and ER2 zones. And of course, anything that's already happened is grandfathered, but that's what it is. And the other big piece that will protect things is of those 7 proposed heritage conservation districts in District 7, 4 of them are in these residential zones: Fort Massey, Victoria Road, Yonge Avenue, and Oakland Road. The special area zones that are proposed, you may remember when David Clark from St. Mary's and Regina Terrace got the city to put in the R1A zone or in the Regina Terrace area. That protection is expanding to the entire what's now would be called the Oakland Road special area, and that whole triangle between Roby, Beaufort, and South will have those same foot of frontage, lot size, backyard, front yard protections that was only on a couple of streets before. And so I actually think the protection for the character of the neighborhoods is much stronger under the proposal. But and what has changed is the distribution of the units, right? That in the R2 zone, more people can do a small amount of change instead of just people with really large lots and really large houses being able to do a tremendous amount of very disruptive change. And I think that on the balance is a much better approach for than what we have now. Not even, there was no way we were going to zone the R2 down to R1 and say you can't do any conversions anymore. That's not something council supported. It's not something we've been directed to do. And it's not something we endorsed in the purple document or any of the drafts to this point. But in terms of what we've been asked to do, and that's 16%, I think what's in front of us is very, very good and an improvement over what we have now in so many ways. The RC1 zone being gotten rid of, the R2A zone being gotten rid of, all of those things are going to be very good for my residents. So, not to say I have a list of 12 or 14 things that I want to amend when we get to community council, but they're all kind of more housekeeping and niggly bits around the edges. So I'd like to thank staff for listening to people after the last draft, to my residents and to the councillors in this committee, and making substantial changes from the very aggressive proposal that we had to this much more modest proposal that we have now. And I think it hits all the numbers for me. So I thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Wei. Maybe I think I had my own hand up here anyway, but I guess I can
Yeah.
chime in when I like. I was wondering, Ben, if you could explain the interaction between the new established residential zoning and the established residential special areas. Now, some of the zoning kind of, especially ER3, kind of plows through these special areas. So, so which one would take precedence? Special areas are provided some indication of, as you said in your presentation, conforming with local character and so on and so forth in those special areas. But obviously the ER3 corridors provide for more dramatic change. So which one is taking precedence here, and how do the two areas interact?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Fred, and happy to try to clarify, and I appreciate the comments from Councillor Mason just now as well. On one hand, when you compare the maps, we do find we did look to have the special areas and the ER zones not necessarily aligned. So one change from the previous draft is like the Halifax and West special area, for example, special area, I believe is pulled back from the ER3 zone, recognizing that if you're going out, that townhouse form is a different form and wouldn't necessarily be consistent with the special area intent. Having said that, the special area isn't about controlling the different uses or the different number of units. It's about controlling the built form, regardless of how the rooms are organized within the building. So the special area is focused on things like minimum frontage and lot coverage, side setbacks, and things like that. Things that are unique to different neighborhoods and carry forward that can be applied to a building regardless of whether it's a 1 unit or a 2 unit building. So they're in some ways, especially areas independent of the zoning of the specific ER zone. But at the same time, there is some coordination between the two. I think, as you rightly point out, that the ER3 zone and the intent of the special area to maintain the things. If it's a change from a kind of existing R1 to ER3, then that's obviously a potential change for the area. And I think when you can compare the maps, you see that those two don't overlap in most cases, with the exception of, I think, some of the spot ER3 zones that are applied based on existing zoning.
Okay, thanks.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so the two things the two designations can live in harmony, but in the case of ER3, those that will take precedence if the ER3 corridor happens to run through a special area. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, I mean the two can work together. So for example, if a special area has establishes a maximum lot coverage, then that would apply to all the uses and in all the uses in the different zones that might be permitted in that might be located in a special area, including ER3. Yeah, but having said that, I think you'll find that a lot of the ER3 that it doesn't run through the special areas, because I think, as you rightly point out, that's not necessarily consistent with the intent of the special areas.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Morris. And
thank you. Sorry, I was distracted here by my phone. I'm wondering if Ben, if you could say a little bit more about the transition established residential transition areas. It seems to me that's where there would be the most concern of residents if there's something larger going into an established residential area. So could you just say a little bit about how you arrived at some of the setbacks and modifications and what you're trying to achieve there, please?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and through the chair. So the most significant transitions were actually included in package A and apply to more of the corridor and higher residential zones and downtown zones. So that's where it's kind of requirements that pushes the requirements for buffering not onto low density areas but into the higher density developments, where the setbacks have to be larger, I think at least 6 meters, and with a landscaped area in between, and the building needs to step back. So if it's a taller building, there's it's trying to mitigate the impacts of the building, wind, and especially shadow on a low density area, so that in those few cases where corridors and HR zoning does about a low density area, that does our buffer in between. And I think the other important approach is just the detailed approach to the heights framework, where individual streets and blocks have a specific height assigned to it in policy, not just in regulation. And so, care was intentionally care was made to direct higher taller buildings to centers or areas that are well buffered from low density areas, with generally keeping it to a mid-rise or 4 to 6 story range along when those kind of corridors are about a low density area. I think within the ER zones, there are also some buffering and additional setback requirements for when a townhouse development abuts a single unit or a 2 unit dwelling as well. More modest, because the impact of a townhouse isn't really all that different from another low density dwelling, but there is some landscaping and buffering controls included as well.
Okay, and is there some accepted wisdom on the 6-story height cap? Where does that come from? How did we arrive at that? Sorry, I wasn't around for the discussion, but are you able to give it to me in a nutshell about how we arrive. I think 6 stories sounds very good. Eyes on the street kind of idea, but was there a consensus on 6 stories?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll answer briefly, and I may ask Kasia Tota if you're available to jump in, who is more involved in those past discussions. But it was, through package A, and it's not just 6 stories. In some cases, it's more of a 4 stories or 14 meters that would be appropriate in a low density context. And it, really depends on the existing nature and the importance of, is it a transit route or is it not, and just in the nature of it. And Kasia, maybe you can shed a bit more light on those package A discussions and how we kind of arrived at the framework that's actually in place today.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Ben, and through the chair to the councillor. So there were, as you know, there was a lot of consultation and many different phases, from visioning to more detailed scenario planning and different scenarios for growth. So one of the scenarios was, let's put all the density in a couple of the centers and downtowns and put it all in one place, or do you want to distribute the density and therefore create kind of more walkable communities in various neighborhoods, increase density in a little more gentle way, but throughout the center. So this way, you're sharing the density, but you're also not creating impacts in one location, be it transit or traffic or parking, or whatever else. So I think that the scenario that the community picked was to kind of distribute the density in various areas, Peninsula and Dartmouth. And part of it, of course, human scale design and pedestrians first is also a big component. And buildings that are about 20 meters high don't have as much of a shadow or wind impact on the pedestrian realm as others. So over 20 meters, we actually require a wind and kind of shadow studies. But those kind of mid-rise forms don't have those kinds of impacts. In particular, when you have appropriate step backs, we also have maximum building dimensions. Tower dimensions when you get beyond that. So that was the forum through many discussions, and also looking at best practice in other cities on urban design and the kind of mid-rise form. I think that's the kind of 20-meter height was picked. Not every quarter is 20 meters. We actually have a range between 11, 14, and 20, but anywhere where we are touching established residential areas, we typically, in most cases, stuck to 20 meters.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric Burchell.
Hi, good day, folks. Just wondering if somebody on staff, maybe Ben or somebody else, could speak to, I guess, the anticipated uptake of additional units from the secondary and backyard suites. So we know the council approved it, I guess about a year ago, if my date's correct. I'm just wondering what the impact of that has been. What are we seeing on the permit side, and what are staff forecasting with regards to absorption or creation of additional units in the ER zones from that policy? Can you give us a sense? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I recall seeing some information in emails about that a number of weeks ago, and I'm afraid I don't remember the details. So if any staff online recall, feel free to jump in. But I mean, in general, I think what we're hearing from our permitting staff has been a lot of inquiries, a lot of interest. And we are starting to see permits come in, and numbers are going up in the previous years, not necessarily as high as we expected at first. But I will note that one of the barriers in the regional center has been the conversion of existing accessory structures to backyard suites in particular, and in package B, the previous draft, having to meet the new controls. And for an existing structure that was built at a time when there was no side yard setbacks for a sector suite, that would limit some of the existing sector structure. So through this revised draft, we're looking to kind of remove those barriers by allowing those existing structures to be developed. So that's one way I think we're looking to increase the uptake. And I see Cash has turned on the video, so I think maybe she might have this information more on hand.
I am trying to find it. I felt like it was maybe 50 or so, but I think we have it in our KPIs in the plan. So maybe I can find it and put in the chat if that's okay. So I think it was, it's just starting to pick up, but let me see if I can get your number. If I find, I'll put in the chat. But
Yeah.
I'm here. It's definitely picking up, but
Okay.
initially it was a bit of a slower start, of course.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for the committee just to understand what you guys see as far as trajectory going forward for that. How effective is that new policy going to be in that creation of those gentle density units?
It does. I mean, I think we talked to the CDAC in the past that in other cities, it's not, it's not a flood necessarily right away. Some cities actually need to put in some incentives and grants to help with investment. Not every property owner, even if they would like to, it is significant investment to actually retrofit your house, and there are Halifax water fees. So I think our housing planners are also looking at some potential incentives down the road to increase it, but it's not, it's not a huge number right away, but it's definitely picking up. But I'll try to find the number. Sorry about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I can just chime in quickly there too. So the numbers we're seeing that Kasia has jumped in on are HRM wide as well. So it's not just the regional center. And I think it was approaching somewhere between 30 and 50, if I recall, and there might have been about a third of that in the regional center. With that said, I've also heard quite a bit of, I've had chatter with a number of people that are considering it. So it's starting to, people are learning about it more and more. So I anticipate it's going to start taking off a little more too. Just want to throw that in there.
Would, just for clarification's sake, would those numbers include folks that might have had a backyard, already had a backyard suite or an attached apartment that they were probably perhaps not registered legally and are now doing that? Would these numbers be picking up some of that, or is this all new?
So through to you, Fred, the chair. I believe most of them were secondary suites as opposed to backyard suites, and I think they were conversions to ensure they were legal. There's some of that, but there is brand new ones as well. Backyard suites is kind of a new thing that I think people are slowly, gradually learning about, and I don't think there is as much in the way of conversion of backyard suites, but yes, it's a good point you make.
Thank you. So I see Dale, you had your hand up again.
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's the existing one. Perhaps one more thought to throw in there on this. One of the things with the ER3 areas that some folks have challenges with, I think, that I've heard, is it allows for significant new development along a pretty long corridor stretch that, there are probably several kilometers of ER3 corridors. And of course, all of this is available to develop as of right. So if someone wants to do some land assembly, they can obviously develop up to eight townhouse developments and this kind of thing. Is one of the things that I think other cities have seen with this kind of development is a loss of what's termed character homes, homes that are generally, say, over 80 years old, that kind of thing, that add character to the neighborhood, character to a city, and those, obviously, the nature of these corridors is that pretty much everything has to be done through infill. So a lot of these homes get torn down, and some cities like Ottawa, Vancouver, and others are looking at the velocity of the loss of these character homes and they're now trying, which has become quite dramatic, and they're now trying to slow those down, and they're talking about issues like moving more to a neighborhood zoning sort of approach, or neighborhood approval type of thing of new development. And I know one of the whole premises of the center plan is to try to get out of the way of development. But I was wondering how this is managing the push and pull of the potential loss of character homes and the effects on neighborhoods. How are we addressing that with a desire for change and more variety in the housing types? Can we have, I guess what I'm saying is, is there a pathway to have both?
Thanks for the question and comments, Fred. If I may take us through yourself as a chair, respond or comment on your question. I think the approach in the draft is to try to balance those using two different tools, and the main one for preserving kind of the character of different areas is the two tools. The strongest one is a proposed HCD, where areas are intentionally downzoned, with existing controls in place to make sure existing uses can continue and continue to expand. So those areas where some detailed heritage research and potential HCD bylaws could be put in place. So those areas, so that proposed HCD certainly takes precedence, and that's why you might see some areas that actually already contain townhouses, for example, actually zoned ER1 to try to preserve what's there now without encouraging any redevelopment until the HCD process can catch up and establish some controls in those areas. And that's probably the main approach. And the other one, I think what we talked about is the special areas, or the established residential precincts and special areas, where regardless of the heritage perspective, that efforts are made to preserve some of the existing lot patterns, the width of lots and the size of building in those neighborhoods. And that, again, that works with the zones, regardless of whether it's a 1 or 2 unit or a 3 unit building, and just the placement of the ER3 zones. The comment I also put out, I think it was something raised in previous meetings, that in looking at kind of best practices, the experience from other cities that have already done this in the past, that they find that the amount of change isn't the change actually doesn't come to fruition, or it comes to fruition much slowly than initially feared or expected in those cases, where some modest upzoning in areas hasn't resulted in a significant change, and partly it's economics and what people are looking for, that the kind of the change of zoning like ER3 doesn't actually result in wholesale change very, very quickly. And some of these cities are looking to see more change, or actually going forward with even further changes to zoning and also incentive programs. As Kash had mentioned, like just changing the rules around secondary suites, you'll see some modest uptake, but also on top of that, some cities are actually having grant programs or reduced fees or things like that to encourage it. So I guess that's a few different perspectives I will add to your comment there, and I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. Second thing I had was around cluster housing, which is kind of a new concept to package A, and folks are used to kind of trailer parks, but the clustering of homes is a little new in terms of the concept. And from what I understand, it's modest units clustered on one lot without driveways and without roads and that kind of thing. And I guess they're walkable areas, that kind of thing. How is and there's only a small number of those that I could discern from the map. but how do you address issues, like, fire access, emergency access, I guess, better term, various things, ambulance, stuff like that, if you can't get to the front of a house because they're in these cluster areas. How does, or perhaps my interpretation is not correct of what these look like.
Yeah. Thanks for the comment, Fred, and the observation. This is something that we thought about as well, and did some research and preparing the zone, and found that the emergency service access, fire departments, and things are already covered through our as-of-right process reviews, particularly our engineering reviews. So it's the same is true for multi-unit buildings, that there is a kind of review process, and certainly a shared driveway that serves a number of different units actually gets a name and a civic number, and fire services and ambulance need to be able to get in there. And that's something that it doesn't, we thought about whether or not we needed to put specific language about it in the land use bylaw, and found that it was already covered through a different controls in terms of the as-of-right permitting process. So yeah, I agree with you that's important to cover off, and it's our understanding that's kind of already in place through our standard process. And one other little perspective I'd add is that the cluster housing is certainly new for the regional center context, but the clustering of small low density homes on the same lot isn't all that new and Nova Scotia wide. And was reminded the other day that it's actually included in the Bedford West under that big comprehensive development agreement. You're seeing some cluster housing there. Clayton Developments is a proposal for the Port Wallace area under that master planning process, and it's fairly common in some more kind of towns and more rural communities that are around Nova Scotia, but certainly new for the regional center context, which hasn't provided an avenue for that kind of development form. And I guess that's one of the reasons why we're proposing it now, is to open the door to that potential, and in a limited way into regional center for affordability reasons.
So thank you, Ben. So we've run through all the questions on the established residential. I suspect there are others or other perspectives out there as well, and staff has been pretty good at responding to emails and questions. But I, as chair, I'll continue to collect whatever questions come to me and forward them on to staff, and as questions, concerns, that kind of thing. So having said that, let's move on to we have about half an hour left. So the downtown presentation, we may not finish our discussion on that, but we can certainly start. So over to you, Ben, to jump into that.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. I think with that, I'm going to share my screen again and jump back into that presentation. Here it is. Okay. And can everyone see that? Or Fred, if you can just give me a nod to make sure that.
Yeah,
okay.
we're good.
And so, no. Okay. Here we are. Working a little bit slower, but it's still working. So just a brief overview, focusing the next few slides on the downtown designation, and specifically the downtown Halifax zone. I think as committee members recall, it was applied to downtown Dartmouth, and through package B, we're proposing to apply the downtown designation to downtown Halifax as well. And it's intended to support, of course, the largest and most intense uses where the highest density and these intensity of uses are encouraged. The downtown designation establishes the downtown Halifax zone and 8 special areas to fine tune the different design controls. As a reminder that the downtown Halifax plan would continue to apply to the existing heritage conservation districts, the Barrington Street and the Old Starborough. And this is because of the complexity of working with the heritage legislation, and expect it to be pulled into the central plan framework through the downtown Halifax HCD process that is underway. There was one proposed heritage conservation district, historic properties, which is part of that process. 9 proposed pedestrian oriented commercial streets, so that's an increase of 7 from the existing 2. And also some detail, also policies support the development of detailed policies for the Cogswell area to be incorporated into a planned policy and the completion of master planning. Are expecting to get on with that work immediately after the approval of Package B. So get into a bit more details about the designation and the downtown zone and how it compares to the existing downtown Halifax plan. In many ways, I'd say it's a continuation of the good work that was done through HRM by design, with a bit of an evolution of the approach, kind of more from a guidelines to more of a full form-based code approach. So some specifics is about continuing to regulate density by maximum building heights, subject to the Halifax Citadel view planes and ramparts. So while we use floor area ratio in centers in downtown Dartmouth, because downtown Halifax is really limited by the view planes, felt that continuing to control density through maximum building height makes the most sense for this area. The bit of one of the major changes is the changes in the bonus zoning, whereas HRM by design led the way with introducing the bonus zoning concept. It was based on a pre-bonus and a post-bonus height, and through Package B, we're pulling to propose the downtown Halifax and the central plan framework about requiring bonus zoning for 20% of the floor area, about 2,000 square meters of development. So I think it's a little bit more of a fair way of distributing the bonus zoning requirements and being clear about maximum building heights, and also updating those categories and the rates to be consistent with the central plan framework. Another, just for comparison, changes is whereas the existing downtown Halifax plan has the ICO zone for institutional uses, the proposed central plan framework has the institutional UC2 zone for the part of the university, and the PCF for the park zone applied to the small parcels in downtown Halifax, and that's consistent with the Package B framework. The HRM by design established wind protocols, and those are updated through the central plan and continue to be applied here, and also introducing the shadow performance standards around the parks. As I kind of briefly mentioned, another kind of key change is the land use bylaw design requirements are replaced the design manual. So I think I've described this as best as an evolution, whereas the HRM design by design kind of led the way in terms of really putting the focus on building design, things like street walls and articulation and glazing. And through Package A, really Package A did the heavy lifting of codifying that into land use bylaw requirements, and Package B kind of builds on that and focuses the use of the site plan tool on those exceptions instead of the kind of codified rules that are built right into the land use bylaw. So as I mentioned, the site plan approval is aligned with the central plan framework with the site plan variation used for the exceptions. And just to get into a bit more detail about the site plan approval variation, because that has been a major feature of the existing downtown Halifax plan, with many proposals looking for variations. In general, and I will note that some of the existing flexibility is incorporated right into the land use bylaw regulations. So for things like sloping conditions, or if to accommodate different lot configurations and land uses. So a lot of that flexibility can be codified and put right into the land use bylaw, with the variations focused on building design items that require some sort of discretionary decisions and can also benefit from public and committee advice. The proposed site plan variations in the land use bylaw are summarized on the slide here, are for roof edge setbacks, for height exempted features, that's a continuation. Things like street wall articulation, so if a building wanted to do something that's a little bit different than every 8 meters, that it still respects that still contributes to the streetscape, that could be considered as well. Different grade oriented premises, so not to rule out maybe a large format store, provided they still break it up and still make it interesting for the pedestrian on the ground floor. Maximum building dimensions, that's kind of not so much applicable to downtown Halifax, as there aren't controls in place for the lower levels, and it doesn't apply to the tower portion. So kind of no ability to build larger towers than the maximum set out in the land use bylaw. There's flexibility for the form and design of institutional and community facility uses, recognizing that these oftentimes intentionally wanted to do something different and be grand or do something different. So to accommodate places of worship and things and art galleries and things like that, they may want to do a different type of built form, and also to provide some avenues to deal with potential conflicts between heritage requirements and the design controls as well. And probably what some of the key changes from the existing framework is that there's limited ability to vary some of the built form controls, where under existing plan, proponents can ask to vary things like side yard setbacks or the width of a tower. These are not included in package B framework, and instead focus on more of some of the building design features. In terms of the built form, in general, it's the downtown Halifax zone maintains most of the existing built form regulations that generally carried forward in terms of a maximum tower width and setbacks. Some items have been aligned with the center plan framework, include allowing for rooftop greenhouses and solar collectors to exceed maximum building height. So a couple of more height exempted features. Aligning the controls around grant oriented premises on pedestrian oriented streets with the center plan framework as well. Minor changes to projections and overhangs and cavaliers. There are also some lower maximum street wall heights in some precincts. The downtown Halifax plan allows for up to 21.5 meters, I believe, in some streets, whereas package B is proposing to kind of limit that more to 18.5 meters. To try to keep that keep with the human scale design. Another change is a proposal to prohibit pedways, and I think I just note that this in the MPS policy notes that this might need to be revisited for the Cogswell area in particular, and also the interior lot setbacks for mid-rise portion of the buildings. Whereas under the current downtown plan, there's a bit of a formula for how that could work, whereas the central plan clarifies this with having a kind of a standardized setback that there is no variation option for. In terms of the precincts, the current downtown Halifax plan establishes 8 different precincts, and these are generally carried forward under package B, with a couple of different additions for the Cogswell lands and the northwest, a combination combining the north end gateway and also for Purdy's Wharf. And just noting that some of the Barrington Street will have to be included in it during when the HCDs are pulled into the plan. And many of the special areas are also pulled forward from the existing downtown Halifax plan to continue to regulate the different patterns and street walls related for the downtown Halifax center blocks, the Halifax waterfront special area. I think in the last presentation we explained that there are also some additional flexibilities included in response to feedback from Development Nova Scotia. Continuing the central downtown Halifax for the street wall and also the Nova Center. Other special areas are continued, like South Park and Spring Garden Road, to ensure adequate sunlight can reach the streets, and a couple of new special areas proposed for the Scotia Square complex, and that's to deal with the unique size and grades of the building on that site, and also for the Cogswell land to enable the downtown Halifax zone to be applied immediately upon the closure of the street. Again, with the policy direction to look at detailed policies for those lands as that master planning work progresses. And lastly, I'll just highlight the addition of a number of new proposed pedestrian-oriented commercial streets. So under the current plan, it's limited to Spring Garden Road and Barrington Street, which is being maintained under the downtown plan. As we package B, proposing to add South Street, Grafton Street, Argyle Street, Carmichael Street, Duke Street, Granville Street, and Lower Water Street. And as a reminder, pedestrian-oriented streets are those streets that require ground floor commercial uses on the ground floor, to keep it an active street front. So things like shops and services that encourage people coming and going and window shopping, the active streetscapes that we want to see in our downtowns. And with that, I think that hopefully provides a little bit more of a detailed overview in terms of the downtown Halifax zone and how it compares to the existing downtown Halifax plan. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it back to you, Fred, for committee discussion.
Thank you. So we'll use the same approach here. Just raise your hand or click on the raise hand button, and we'll call your name to comment on this. Just a quick question on this, on the pedestrian-oriented commercial streets. Just to clarify for Mike, what portion of South Street, or the portion below Barrington?
Oh, I might ask. I recall off the top of my head. I don't have the map right in front of me. And
Okay, sorry.
Dallas Law was our kind of a lead planner from the team working on the Halifax hand. I know she's on the meeting. I don't know if Dally, you can jump in and clarify the POCs and how it applies to South Street or any other of the team.
Yes. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of CDAC. I was actually just about to put the screen or to bring up the map to kind of clarify exactly where it applies. But the intent is essentially to, if I can mute myself just for a few seconds, and just maybe if Mr. Chair, maybe we can move on to any other questions or requests by the committee while I get more information and kind of pull up the map. And
it was just a clarification, so we can
okay
later. That's fine.
Okay, no worries. A few seconds.
Any other thoughts, questions out there? Ben, could you talk about the pedway issue a little bit? The pedways have become kind of important, perhaps even kind of vital links between hotels and venues and that kind of thing. And I've heard it called one of the attractions of Halifax as a convention destination is having that kind of linkage. And I do understand the challenges there, because I've also been in cities where that turn dead because there's no one on the street anymore. Everyone's in the pedways or in the underground tunnels or whatever, like Toronto or Montreal. But how are you balancing that? I guess the commercial tourism side of things with the desire to have obviously more people on the street, that kind of thing.
Thanks. I think thanks for the comments, Fred. And I think you hit on the reasons just in asking your questions and making your comments. And I think the reason for not requiring new pedways going forward is exactly for the reasons you pointed out, that in other cities that actually have a lot more pedways or other areas are actually kind of working to sometimes turn back the clock. A city like the Toronto or Montreal that has incredible amount of density, they can usually support their underground pathway networks, and those often are lined with shops and services. So they try hard not to have it be just hallways. They're actually underground malls. Whereas some of there's a variety of cities in North America, but one that comes to mind is Minneapolis, that has an extensive pedway network, and they experience exactly the same situation, dealing with the concerns that you just mentioned, where the streets become inactive, right? Everyone's up walking above, and the office workers walk between buildings instead of having activity on the street. And with the emphasis on pedestrian-oriented commercial streets and having active streetscapes, we didn't feel that pedways was consistent with those core concepts of having pedestrian-oriented design and having that active shops and services on the streets that we want to see in downtown Halifax. So that's the primary rationale for that.
Yeah, and it's certainly a good rationale. Have you kind of balanced that against the idea of the utility that those bring? Obviously, the existing ones, And we do get a heck of a lot of rain in Halifax, rain and snow and sleet and whatever, except for this time of year. So they do have their utility, I guess, as something useful on the tourism and convention side.
Yeah, certainly, Fred, thanks for the comments. That, you know, not to say that there's only negatives with Pedways, as you say, there's also positives to consider. And it, you know, I wouldn't say it was a, you know, there were some pros and cons to consider, but on the balance, looking at both the kind of the positive and negatives, we felt that there was more negatives than positives, and that's why it's proposed not to be allowed. I would point out that pedways will still be permitted, you know, interior to a lot. So, you know, between two buildings, it doesn't cross between two buildings on a lot. That, you know, yes, pedways could be put in there, but over a street, the proposed not to be.
Yeah. So enough on pedways. Eric, you had a thought?
Thanks, Fred. Just, I guess it sort of carries on the question with regards to street animation and the objectives for it. I feel for you guys having to draft the final version of this through the pandemic with all the challenges with downtown retailers. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to how the year that we've just gone through and the experience that those retailers have had, how that has impacted your thinking around both the requirements for, as we all would agree, the desirability of the active streetscapes, but with the reality of retail viability in those spaces. That was true pre-pandemic and certainly going to be more so in the near term, hopefully not in the longer term, but, you know, with the retail landscape changing over time and certainly other market forces at bay, how are staff incorporating all that into the thinking about the requirement for ground floor retail?
Yeah, thanks for the comment, and through the chair, through Fred. Yes, this was a kind of top of mind when we were looking at these revisiting the pedestrian-oriented commercial streets, and particularly not just downtown Halifax, but it's also an approach applied to a number of different kind of main type streets in the regional center. I think I briefly mentioned last week that that's for the reasons why you just outlined. It's one reason why outside of downtown, we felt it was appropriate to relax, I guess, the restrictions on the types of commercial uses in some of these main streets. So under the package A, it limits to kind of more of a shops and services, and it doesn't allow for offices. So outside of downtown, we thought, okay, offices, you know, we'd rather see, the point is to see successful businesses along these streets, you know, and offices can also be fairly animated. And we stopped short of allowing offices in a downtown setting because the nature of the offices in a downtown setting can be fairly, I'll say stark, but, you know, not all that animated, and that there is more demand for shops and services. So, you know, I don't, you know, I guess it remains to, we'll see if this is the right balance. I think we have the same concerns that about post-pandemic will we bounce back, but I think there's it might be too early to tell to revisit that for downtown Halifax, and so we think maintaining the course for downtown Halifax is appropriate, and kind of hoping that with the vaccinations that we will see a bounce back. The other thing that was talked about last week is I think providing a bit more flexibility on grade-oriented premises, whereas package A was fairly prescriptive, and we got some feedback that it might have been overly prescriptive about the size of the width of grade-oriented premises, and not really providing an exception so that somebody wanted to be bigger. They just kind of hit a hard stop. So the additional flexibility is introduced there to partly to deal with what you're talking about, the impacts of the pandemic, that on one hand, they're just made a little bit more flexible from the get-go, so that a small business can evolve into a medium business and not have to go through too many hurdles, and also providing that for that variation option. So if there is a grocery store, for example, that wants to locate in downtown Halifax and wants to have a larger grade-oriented premise for whatever business reason, that there's that variation option that they can apply for and provided they animate that streetscape in a different way that may not include lots of doors, but can still resemble that kind of fine-grained retail experience that we want to see. So those are two main perspectives I think we looked at, but we do think that the pedestrian-oriented commercial street still has value going forward.
Thanks, Ben and Eric. Any changes to the to view planes in the new language in package A? I just saw it there in a different language this time as I was going through it, but
yeah.
I don't know if there are changes or not.
Thanks for the question, Fred, and the opportunity to highlight some things. I mean, in general, no. I mean, I think some of the language might be different just for clarification. Certainly continue to carry forward the view planes, and I think through package A, they and in this draft carrying forward more accurate information about the view planes are actually surveyed, so it's absolutely clear where they are, and there's no questions. The one bit of clarification I will point out through package B that we're still working on the survey work for is around the Citadel Rampart sight line. So the views from within the Citadel to make sure that when you're in there, you don't see any buildings sticking out from behind the rampart walls. That under the last draft, we realized that it wasn't very clear about the views that were behind the Cavalier building, so the big building in the Citadel. Technically, what was being required is that building was being treated like it was invisible, so that the views, kind of theoretical views from behind a brick wall, were protected by the existing language. So through package, we're proposing to add those survey points and to take that into account, so that it's realistic views from within the parade square that are being protected, and not kind of theoretical views of Superman being able to look through brick walls being protected. And it does have some minor impacts on building heights, particularly in the kind of north part of downtown Halifax area.
Yeah,
I think that would be the only kind of significant change. And the rest, I think language, any other language changes, I think was just for clarity.
Thank you. Eric, you didn't have another question, did you? I guess.
Sorry, no, Fred, just still had my hand up.
Yeah, okay. So we're kind of winding down. Ben, you've already taken the center plan to a couple of other HRM committees to roll it out. It'd be interesting to see what their perspective was. If you have, just a few thoughts on what comments that come out of those other committees, the two you've talked to so far.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Thanks for the opportunity to fill committee members in. And I think I'll be careful to kind of give some highlights, but without speaking for the committees, because it's not my role. But last week we did present at the Harbor East, the Harbor East Community Council, and there was a good discussion at that committee, and both Councillor Austin and Councillor Messinian proposed make some recommendations. I think largely site-specific in nature, about to make some adjustments to the zone. I think from staff's point of view, we consider them fairly minor, and I don't have too many concerns. And I see that Councillor Austin's is online here, so if he wishes to speak to that committee in his motion, then I'm sure that would be welcome from this committee. And just yesterday we were at the Heritage Advisory Committee. At that meeting, we provided the overview, and there was a good discussion. They went through all the correspondence they received, and they're holding off on making kind of the recommendations. We're going to be revisiting the Heritage Advisory Committee later in June. I believe it's either June 23rd or June 24th. I think, and so there was some discussion about the Yonge Avenue special area at that meeting yesterday.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So it's moving around, moving through the approval process. Next week we come back together, most of us, to look at changes, whatever changes in package A. And I guess it's an opportunity to, for cleanup too, to see if there's anything else that's out there that we want to deal with. I think on the 26th, we come back together to consider our motion to community planning and economic development to move the center plan forward. So that's the timeline. Just to clean up, a little bit of cleanup, I'm just note for those that didn't notice the chat. I think there's been, in terms of backyard suites, I think there's been a total of 4 approved permits, mostly outside the regional center, 1 each in Bald Rock, Hubli, Seabright, and Tantallon, and then 28 backyard suite, or 28 secondary suites, of which 14 were in Halifax, 3 in Dartmouth, and the others spread around. And as Eric said, that I think there's probably a lot of cleanup in that of suites that weren't technically legal at the time. Let's see. So the question on South Street South Street is not designated as a POC street, but a portion of South Street is the portion between Spring Garden Road and Brenton Place. So there's your answer to that question. So I think that's it until next week, and I'll look at package A and whatever cleanup we need. Anything else from anyone for the good of the meeting? Hearing Dale.
Just listening to the dialogue, which is very good. I was wondering what parts of, say, Connaught Avenue, Shabukdo, any of those streets is going to be developable, and what part is considered as ER3 or ER2? Or are there any overlaps like that? I'm just wondering, is it at the south end or the west end or where? It would be good to have sketches of how much, or maybe it's all, maybe it's everything. Shabukdo from the beginning to end, Connaught from beginning to end, I don't know.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks, Dale, for the question and try to. I think the easiest way to look at it is to use our central plan interactive zoning map, where you can look up. You can kind of scroll through the regional center and look at where the placement of the zoning. So for the ER3 in particular, I think in comparison to the last draft, it is on a reduced number of streets in different areas, and really focus on where there's either existing high frequency transit, not just any transit, but high frequency transit, or a planned BRT route, which is intended to be a pretty major investment in transit infrastructure. So on Connaught Avenue, that would just be the portion of it, I believe that's between Quinpool and Bears, and not the other portions of it that aren't planned to be transit routes. And for other streets, I kind of don't have the map right ahead of me, but it would be only those portions that are those kind of major transit routes. And the other places I mentioned earlier, the other place the ER3 zone is applied is the kind of existing kind of townhouse or that type of zoning.
Thank you. Councillor Morris.
Thank you, and apologies if I missed this, but is there anywhere in this document where there's a statement that says we are trying to accommodate a projected growth level of such and such while increasing the diversity of our housing forms to allow for a more diverse population while accommodating our special cultural heritage characteristics? Is there anything that kind of summarizes this incredible effort that is being made here to build the city, but makes it more explicit what our assumptions are?
Thanks for the comment and to try to make perhaps not quite so succinctly as you just put it, but yes, the secondary proposed secondary planning strategy, especially in the introduction section, really tries to lay out the kind of existing context and the vision going forward, culminating with those core concepts. So the plan doesn't get into specific numbers because this is a plan that might last for decades, and having those in the plan that might not make sense, but does speak to the target of of the up to 40% of growth of the municipality being accommodated, and it primarily being directed to certain designations, and speaks to the whole purpose of the established residential designation. And I think all the good stuff you just mentioned is summarized first in the introduction section, and then in the preambles and policies of the individual designations gets into a bit more detail. So I don't know if there's and of course the staff report also provides a good summary, so we can kind of point you to those, but I'd say the first place to start would be the introductory chapter of the secondary planning strategy, which really tries to clearly outline the context, the vision, and the overall framework.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll have a closer read of that then. Thanks.
Thank you. And a big thank you to staff for all the work that's gone into this. I mean, we're getting towards the end of this process, and at least as one committee member, it has this feeling of an elastic being stretched. So I'm thankful that no one has snapped around this process, and everyone has been well behaved and put their questions forward with respect, which is it was greatly deserved by the staff that have been involved in this process. So again, thank you very much. We'll be back together in a short time. An agenda will be circulated along with any other materials or correspondence that gets received. We stand adjourned.
Instead of adjourned.